It's very difficult for me to explain how the King's Dilemma Chronicles works without veering into some spoiler territory. So if you're going to be worried about the fact that I'm going to spoil a heavily driven narrative experience, then leave this review with the knowledge that this game is fantastic. I love it to bits, adored it, enjoyed every single playthrough that I've done so far, and it's 2 thumbs up from me. If that has now intrigued you to stick around, I will try and leave the spoilers to the very, very end where I can, but I'll be explaining the gameplay loop and how this game works without diving too much into actual story spoilers. So, let's dive in. What is the King's Dilemma Chronicles? This game sees you take over a timeline of kings of a specific country. That country can change every time you play because it starts off with a little BuzzFeed style questionnaire to match you to certain types of kingdoms depending on which, how you answer those questions. Each kingdom has its own unique story arc goal that it's working towards with some secondary stuff too. But ultimately, the overarching story is that there's some kind of prophesized end game event that's going to take place. And so you better be ready for when it comes. This takes place over a course of loads and loads of choices that form how your country is going to prepare for that event. And I would say that this game is split into 2 sections. The first is the preparation side, which is pretty much 85% of the game. And then when the end game event takes place, which is what you're working towards, you will then have loads of decisions to make to kind of decide your fate, basically. And how you've prepared for that will decide very much how that part goes. Your gameplay loop is going to be spent in the preparation phase, building out your country in preparation for whatever this end game event is, because you don't necessarily know in your first playthrough. Definitely you won't anyway. You'll be presented with a map screen with loads of different decision narrative points on, and you get to pick and choose which ones you want to go for. This is because there are 6 slightly co-joined story arcs that are all going on at once, and you can pick and choose how fast and slow you want each one to go. And so this lends itself quite neatly to good replayability, because you'll make different decisions depending on what order you pick on things, because you'll have only seen part of the story. And this is one of the great things about this game, is that it's quite heavily replayable, because not only have you got all of these different factions to try and filter out and understand all of their motives, evasions, and all of their secondary story arcs that they're getting, you've also got this overarching kind of what's happening for the end game. Are you going to be a noble, upstanding kingdom, or are you going to be a downright dirty one and throw everyone else under the bus in hope for your own survival? Once you decide on the choice that you're going to make, every decision has a couple of sentences to explain what the decision that you're expected to make is about. And then you'll be taken to the council and voting screen. And this is where you'll spend the majority of your time. In the council and voting screen, you'll have the council that's currently elected on the left-hand side with their A's or nays, depending on a decision that's being made. You can then decide an A or nay and either go with the consensus or break a consensus, or you can vote against something, but doing so will cost you this shield, which is basically your political acumen and standing. And on the right-hand side, there are 5 different measures and metrics that your kingdom is being judged by, and also your reign. So it's things like influence, wealth, welfare, knowledge, all of that kind of stuff that's going on, and morale is the 5th one, where you're constantly sliding these things up and down. Go towards the top and it's deemed as being opulent and bountiful. Slide towards the bottom, much less so. However, what you'll be seeing there is on that tract a style of reign, and therefore you've got dark and light. And so what you're doing with this is trying to work out, depending on the type of reign that your king has chosen, and then once your first king dies, what you have chosen afterwards. It might not be good to have everything in the top, because what happens is that when you die at the end of each reign, and you can see the death counter just to the right hand side of that, with the kind of hourglasses going towards death, you will basically convert depending on where all of those 5 attributes are, will get converted to light and dark currency crowns for you to then spend preparing for this end event. Make sense-ish? It's really tricky to understand because it's so layered, and that's the beauty of this game, is that every decision genuinely matters, because very few have just like a single effect. So it might be that you need to spend a lot of money to get some like herbal medicinal knowledge, so that will shove knowledge up the tract, but it will then shove coins down. And if you've decided that you're going to be an opulent leader, everything needs to be in the top half with the light, so that you score all of these extra light or dark crowns. The other thing that you can do is spend stuff to generate money, for example. So that might mean that you're trying to be a different type of leader and need everything down at the bottom. And it depends on that leadership style as to where you need those 5 things in the tract. The problem with that is that that's not necessarily what the rest of the council want. And so, if you continue to vote against the council, you'll lose political acumen, and then you get kicked out, and the king basically has to step down. So, if you do that within 3 decisions, you lose all of the stuff that you was preparing for that reign to then make a change and an improvement to your kingdom for the end game event to come. So you need to play the game with the kingdom and the council to make sure that you don't kind of step out of line too often. You also need to make sure that you're not too extreme on one option or another for all of your 5 traits, because that can also mean that you're being deemed as an unruly and not sustainable king, and so you'll have to step down there. And then if you survive enough rounds of that, eventually you'll get to the point where the king just dies of old age. And so you'll then have like a reign that replaces stuff. But the longer you stay in power, the more resources that you're able to gain, which then means that you'll do better when it comes to the preparation phase. So you've got all of this spinning around in your head for every single decision that's going on, plus your own country's stance of where they're standing. It's a lot. And it was juicy in a way how there's so many systems going on. But what I loved about this game is that it's constantly moving forward, and it doesn't bog you down in like just endless text and decision making. Everything is really succinctly written. It's really clear visually on the screen what everything does to you, and it's easy to keep track of because you can flick across to like what you're building. For example, it might be that you're adding in a water system so that you can have better care, so that therefore you've got more townspeople that will live longer, which means you'll have more soldiers for your army, which then means that you can feel a little bit more like, oh, do you know what, I can be a bit more aggressive. And different decisions that you make will lock you out of being able to prepare for certain things in this end game event. So, for example, there was one where a different country had offered to trade like a heavily alcoholic substance. But it also means that all of your poor people are going to start becoming alcoholics. And I was like, well, they also work really well as hallucinogenics, and we can use that against our army. And it's like, do you want to? Do you not? Now, you can choose the welfare, obviously, of your people, which means that they're going to be healthier and happier. But I went for let's be aggressive and make everyone high. So I took that in, which then meant that there was a preparation that I could use for my end game event. Whereas I'd have been locked out of that if I'd have chosen the welfare over my people. So again, loads of decisions having a impact. The longer you stay in a reign, the more choices of future types of reigns that you'll get as well. And if you're able to stick to the same style of reign over and over and over again, then that will unlock additional things that can be used for resources to build things as you go. And then what will happen is that there's only a finite amount of choices in this game, and you'll move towards your end game when those 6 story arcs come to an end. And then the eclipse of the sun takes place, which then is like a metaphor for the end game event. Now, I'm going to talk about the end game event because that is a proportion of the game. If you don't know what it is, leave now. You know the game's good, go buy it. Still here? Okay. The endgame event is basically a war between the uprising of all the different story arcs that have taken place around you versus whether you want to stick with the council. And depending on who you've made friends with and who you haven't, and how they've all voted, depends on where they sit on the fence. But that also means that whether or not you have been in keeping with the council and making people happy with light decisions, or whether you've been chaotic and gone for a chaos approach and gone for dark decisions, depends on how those things are stacked. So you can play, again, very differently depending on which decision you choose. So it could be that you've been chaotic all the way through and built up the uprising to be absolutely all powerful, and then you've decided to stick with the council and you're going to try and overthrow them from behind. But then all of your decisions and all of your preparation for the war that takes place is going to mean that all the decisions that come up are reflective of the decisions you made to prepare for things. So I had stuff around big fires in towers, and I'd invested in a firefighter team. So I was able to deal with some of that. But if I hadn't invested in that, then I would have had a very different decision, and I'd have been less prepared for that, but more prepared for something else, for example. You can still make good and bad decisions throughout all of this. And what it's doing is basically totting up all of the chaos and light points that start from the base from where you're at, and then through your decisions, your preparations, and whether or not you make that right decision with that preparation, kind of spotting and understanding the nuance in the writing of what it's alluding to based off of what you've built. You can then try and overthrow the uprising, or you can be the uprising and overthrow the council, and then decide whether the world lives in chaos or ruin, or just as it was before, a little bit more happy. I found this hugely replayable, hugely fun, really engrossing, excellent story writing. I did run into a couple of bugs that I've been told will be fixed on a day one patch. However, I did run into a bug that did corrupt a save file. So just be aware, save regularly. It auto saves after every decision anyway. But there might be well worth the opportunity to kind of try and run multiple save files if you can. Yeah, adore this, love it. 2 thumbs up, go buy, go buy, go buy. King's Dilemma Chronicles, out now. Higher Plane Games is part of the Higher Plane Network, a completely independent media outlet supported by people like you. The goal is to create the best possible content that cultivates a richer indie scene for games as well as music and entertainment. To find out more and to get involved, visit patreon.com/Higherplane Network. Your support makes all the difference, and in return you'll gain access to bonus content and downloads. Thank you for watching.